This segment brought to you by Kansas Farm Bureau, the voice of agriculture. To join today or for more information, go to kfb.org or find us on Facebook and Twitter.
Welcome back to Ag AM in Kansas. I'm Brityne Rucker. With most grocery store meat counters empty due to COVID, people are curious about the farm-to-table approach. Speaking with me now is K-State meat science specialist, Dr. Elizabeth Boyle. Welcome, Dr. Boyle.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here today.
Now, if one is wanting to support local and wanting to purchase livestock straight off the farm to process, what are some processing options for people?
There are a variety of processing options people can look at. Typically, if you're going to purchase an animal and consume all of the meat yourself, you would most likely take it to a custom facility. Custom facilities will process the animal, the package will come back not for sale, meaning that only the person who owns the animal can consume that product, they and their family. The other options are to go to a state or federally inspected facility. So if you were wanting to make sure that the meat was harvested under inspection and processed under inspection, and you were looking at maybe reselling some of the meat, if you're going to sell it only in the state of Kansas, you could process it at a state facility. But if you wanted to go across state lines, you would need to process the meat at a federally inspected facility. Now, a fourth option would be to harvest the animal yourself. So that's not a task to be taken lightly, because even though you're not in a plant, there are still regulations associated with harvesting meat at home.
And what are some of those regulations?
So some of those regulations are, if you own the animal, you can harvest the animal. However, you can't ask your neighbor to come and help you harvest the animal, which I found very interesting because they aren't part of the animal owner. You can't pay someone to come in and help you harvest. So according to the Kansas Department of Agriculture Meat and Poultry Inspection, that's not permitted as well. So you, as the owner, can harvest the animal, but then you also have to think, if I harvest this animal, what am I going to do with the offal? Mm-hmm. Where am I going to harvest it that I can do it humanely and follow humane handling practices? If I buy the animal from a producer, can I harvest it on their property if they're on a farm? And the answer is yes, if they give you permission to harvest on their property. But they cannot help you do the harvest. You would still have to do the harvest yourself.
Now, say you go in on a purchase with two people. Can both people process that animal together?
If both people are owners of the animal, then yes. So you can't harvest the animal, sell the meat, and have two owners at the meat sale point. It has to be at the point where the animal is actually purchased. Then both owners of the animal can harvest the animal.
Now, you touched on this earlier, but if you process that animal at your own property, what do you do with the waste and the stuff you don't eat?
So with those parts and pieces, you have to decide, do I want to compost it? It's going to be kind of smelly depending on what you have available for composting facilities on your own personal property. You could check with your waste management company. So would they take it for you? You don't want to just dump it in the trash barrel, assuming they're going to take it. You need to check with them first to see if they are willing to haul it away. You could burn it if your local regulations allow burning. I mean, depending on which city and which county you're in, you may or may not be able to burn the offal. But you've basically got three options, either, a fourth, you could bury it. So again, it's going to depend on what your county regulations are if they allow you to bury the offal in your backyard, whether you can compost it, whether you can have it hauled away by a trash company, or whether you burn it. But you have to plan for those things in advance. You certainly don't want to be harvesting a hog or harvesting the beef and then say, oh my gosh, now what do I do? You want to have all that lined out in advance.
When we return, I'll have more with Dr. Boyle here on Ag Etc.
No one plans to get sick or injured. But when life happens, it's important you and your family are protected. Kansas Farm Bureau health plans are there to provide continued health care coverage to meet your needs. Choose from a broad range of individual and family plans. And if you're over 65, we have options for you too. Learn more at kfbhealthplans.com or contact a Farm Bureau Financial Services agent near you.
I'm Bob Swartz, and I've devoted the last 43 years to helping Kansans reach their retirement goals and to protect the family farm. At Bob Swartz Financial, we believe everyone should be able to live the retirement they've always dreamed of. Our team of professionals can help you create an efficient strategy using a variety of investment vehicles to help you address your financial needs and your concerns. Bob Swartz Financial values commitment and transparency.
Valley Vet Supply is devoted to providing information and professional quality products at reasonable prices.
Valley Vet Supply.
This segment brought to you by Sure Crop, liquid crop nutrition delivered right to your farm.
Welcome back to Ag, Etc. I'm returning with Dr. Boyle discussing processing your own livestock.
For people that are wanting to sell their processed meat, it's really trendy on Facebook that people post, I have processed an animal and I want to sell the meat now. What would be the next step and process of doing so?
So to do that, first they have to make sure if they want to sell that meat that it was harvested at a state or federal facility. If you harvest that meat at home, you cannot sell it anywhere. If you have it harvested at a custom facility, you cannot sell that meat. So it would make the assumption that the animal was harvested at a state or federally inspected facility. So then you would need to get in contact with the Kansas Department of Agriculture, Meat and Poultry Inspection. They do have some licensing requirements, registration requirements in terms of being able to sell meat within the state of Kansas or from the state of Kansas across state lines.
Absolutely. And kind of going back to the basics, but people that are completely unfamiliar with animal processing, there is a difference between live weight and hanging weight. Can you address how to find the dressing percentage of the animal that you're going to harvest?
Sure. So depending on the species you're going to harvest, whether it's going to be pork or beef, there's something called dressing percent. So when we have a live animal, we're taking into account the weight of the hide, of the hooves, of the intestinal tract, of the head, and all those parts and pieces are going to be removed once we harvest the animal, and now we've got a hanging carcass. So you may have 65% of the weight left or 75% of the weight left, but you're going to assume that you're losing at least 30 to 40% of that live animal weight as waste that is not going to be coming out as meat. And then you also have to take into account the bones. So we're going to lose that weight as well when the meat is harvested. So there's a lot of good publications that are available through University Extension. So at KSU Extension, one of my colleagues, Travis O'Quinn, had written a publication that outlines the yield from, for example, a beef carcass and what you can expect.
When we return, I'll have more with Dr. Boyle here on Ag, Etc.
Okay, looks like it's time for our tour. Welcome to the Fort Wallace Museum. Here at the museum, you're going to find some really interesting stuff like our replica stagecoach from the Butterfield Overland Dispatch. We've got facades from the fort buildings. We've got an 1870s flag. There's a plesiosaur that was discovered locally. We've got the Ray pump organ collection. We're a little bitty place with a great big story, and we'd love to have you.
At Farm Credit, we partner with America's farmers who work hard each and every day to grow the food that we all enjoy. It's not an easy task, but it's an important one. Farm Credit is proud to work with farmers and ranchers, lending support in rural America.
Kansas Corn reminds you that E15 fuel is the right choice for every kind of driver. For the car enthusiast, E15 has higher octane. For the thrifty driver, E15 is priced lower than regular unleaded. For the nature lover, E15 provides cleaner air. For the shopper who buys local, E15 has more ethanol from our Kansas corn farms. Choose E15 for a higher octane, lower price, cleaner American fuel. Message from the Kansas Corn Commission. Learn more at kscorn.com.
This segment brought to you by Santa Fe Trail Meats in Overbrook. Let us help feed your family.
Welcome back to Ag Etc. I'm visiting with K-State meat science specialist Dr. Elizabeth Boyle about processing and storing your own meat products.
So what are some proper storage techniques when it comes to storing fresh meat?
When you're harvesting an animal and you're obtaining meat, you have to decide, do I want to vacuum package all the parts and pieces? Vacuum packaging is going to remove oxygen. It's going to, depending on your package permeability characteristics, typically you should get a longer shelf life frozen because you're going to have less air movement, less water movement through that packaging. But you could also opt to use a butcher wrap. You could use a plastic saran wrap or like the self-storage bags. But the important thing is to remove as much oxygen as you can, because oxygen promotes what we call lipid oxidation, which makes fats go rancid faster. And fats even go rancid when they're in the freezer. So there's recommended freezing times in terms of how long to keep a piece of meat. And there's some really good charts online with both FDA and USDA on frozen storage time. So when you've got this fresh meat, you either vacuum package it or you put it in butcher wrap or other type of packaging, then you need to freeze it because no one's going to consume all of that meat at once. And when you freeze it, you have to take into account, how am I going to put all of this meat into my freezer and have it freeze as rapidly as possible? So if you have a shelf freezer, the type of freezer that has a refrigerator door with shelves in it, you could layer the meat on those shelves, and then you get cold air movement above and below the meat product so that it freezes more rapidly. But if you have a chest freezer and you start piling all of that meat in, there's not enough air movement and cooling air getting to the center of that pile of meat that it's not going to freeze well, and you could actually have spoilage in the middle of that pile because of the length of time for that to cool down. So it's really important to space your product out so that you get rapid freezing. The colder the product is, the faster you can freeze it, the better, because that will give you a better shelf life. What happens when we freeze slowly is we get large ice crystals. And those large ice crystals then, when the product thaws, have puncture cell membranes, which causes a lot of purge to happen with the package. You're going to get some purge anyhow, but you'll get more purge if the package froze slowly than if the package freezes really rapidly.
If you had questions about meat processing, or producers had questions about meat processing, where would you send them?
All right, so I get a lot of those calls actually at my office, but another good place to reach out to is the Kansas Department of Agriculture Meat and Poultry Inspection Division. Make sure you're talking to the meat and poultry inspection folks, because they're the ones who have the best understanding of the meats regulations in the state of Kansas. So even though you might get directed to marketing or to some other group, specifically request meat and poultry inspection.
Well, Dr. Boyle, thanks for being on the program.
You're welcome.
Thanks for watching Ag Etc. As always, I'm Brityne Rucker, and I'll see you next week here on Ag AM in Kansas.